night, the rain starts to fall, and it falls hard at a rate that by midnight there was 2.5 inches of rain in the park, and it continued to rain like that for the next 7 days. Now, there was a huge response from the U.S. Air Force, National Park Service, local jurisdictions, etc. Now, Dwight McCarter eventually was the head tracker for the National Park Service in Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and he wrote a book about tracking. And he's been interviewed a couple of times about this case. And we actually went out and interviewed him. He's retired now, and he has a great memory. He goes, I'll never forget this. He said, I was one of the liaisons between Mr. Martin and the National Park Service. So I'll get back to Dwight, but as the search is going on, helicopters are flying in and out, and 2 big helicopters come into the park filled with the Green Beret Special Forces. Now, there's rumors out there that, they were training nearby and just happened to stop by. The reality of it is, I have a file probably 4 inches thick from the National Park Service on this, and nobody that I could ever determine called them. Nobody asked them to come into the search. Nobody gave them permission to land in the park, but they showed up. And McCarter told me that when they came in, they set up their own camp away from everyone else with their own communication systems. And when the National Park Service says, well, why don't we put 3 of your guys with 1 of our guys since we know the area and we could be more efficient searching, they said, no, we'll search by ourselves. Very, very strange, according to McCarter, that no other group had ever done that before. So at the maximum point, there were almost 1,400 searchers inside the park looking for Dennis. And the FBI sent an agent to, quote-unquote, monitor the case, but they didn't suspect that the crime had occurred, but he was going to monitor the case. So the day after Dennis disappears, on the front of the Knoxville Times is a picture of Dennis Martin about this disappearance. The Key family reads it and says, wow, the times are kind of close. I wonder if what we saw on the mountain had something to do with Dennis's disappearance, since it was almost directly below where he disappeared. So the FBI sends an agent and a ranger to contact the Key family, and the Key family says, hey, we'll meet you at the park, and we'll show you the point where we saw this, and you can kind of see the distances and things. FBI says, no, we'll meet you at your house or somewhere in between, but don't come to the park, which is wrong, because as an investigator, you want to see the distances and see if they could see what they claim to see. And so it seemed odd. And Mr. Martin had an agreement with the FBI and the Park Service that any leads that they had on this case, that they would immediately come to him and tell him. He never left the park. He stayed in the park for 6 weeks, nonstop, helping, looking, kind of being the eyes and ears. He's an architect. He's a very smart man. And I think he did the right thing by staying there and monitoring the situation. But make a long story short, that Key family observation wasn't told to him by the FBI or the Park Service. A reporter happened to hear about it from another source, went out and interviewed the Key family, came back and told Mr. Martin that, hey, the FBI has already interviewed this family, and you ought to get on this. This sounds like an interesting lead. So Mr. Martin confronts him, and he gets told a series of lies. He gets told that the time frames couldn't work. He gets told that it wasn't a substantiated sighting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he gets mad. So he gets a hold of McCarter, and he says, hey, Dwight, he says, they're saying that the times don't match up, blah, blah, blah. And McCarter says, well, I think they do. He says, let's you and me just move at a quick pace, but let's see if we could do it. Mm-hmm. The following day they do it, and they do it within the time frame that the Key family saw what they saw. This makes Mr. Martin even more mad that they're outright lying to him now. So he gets a hold, and he actually gets an opportunity to talk to the Key family, and the irritation gets worse. Make a long story short, the Park Service doesn't tell him the truth. They're evasive with their answers. he gets the feeling that he's never told the truth from the beginning. He told me he had the feeling that somebody was pulling strings up the upper end of the National Park Service and that the superintendent was merely a mouthpiece. That was his words. So if this was your son, can you imagine how irate you'd be at this point? So after 2 months, everything starts to wind down. There's rumors that there was a shoe print found somewhere. They didn't really find anything worth a darn. And from what I read on this, and after interviewing McCarter's beliefs were that Dennis was abducted. Even though there's nothing anywhere that says that this was a possibility, he was there at the time, he knew the distances, he knew the facts, and that was his opinion. So I said, well, Mr. Martin hasn't talked to the press since the day this happened, supposedly because even the press lied to him. So myself and another investigator, without a phone call or anything, just went up and knocked at his door. And he came to the door, recognized him, and I explained who I was. I said, I've devoted months to the case. I probably know more about it than anyone other than your family, and I'd like to talk to you. And he says, the disappearance has ruined my life and my wife's life. It's been a compelling issue for all of us. We can't get over the fact we lost our son, and we decided years back to just put it to rest and not talk about it. I said, hey, I came here from California. Can you give me just 15 minutes of your time because I have some really important questions to ask? He opened the door, came outside on the front porch. He says, Dave, you got it. What do you want? So he confirmed everything that I just said. But in addition, whenever I'm interviewing a witness on a case like this, I always ask them a series of questions at the end that I need clarity about and things maybe that I didn't understand. And one of the things I ask is that, what do I need to know about this that wasn't in the press, that wasn't talked about in the media, but has been a compelling issue to you? And Mr. Martin says, well, Dave, he goes, that thing that they saw on the hill? I said, yeah. And he says, there was never anything in the paper, never anything in the media, but that Key family told everyone that whatever they saw had something on its shoulder. And he says they wouldn't put that in the paper. They wouldn't talk about it in public, but they would tell me. When I started to look into this case, there were several others in the general region that disappeared. But in addition to Dennis, there were also 2 other people that disappeared inside that park after him under suspicious circumstances. And in all of these cases in the park and around the park, there was the same FBI agent that was sent by the Bureau to quote-unquote monitor the case. Now, when an agent is sent to monitor a case, every day he writes a series of notes that get sent to Virginia to the profiling center, where other agents look at it and they try to find matching cases in other areas that are similar. And similar to what I'm doing on these cases. And this agent did this in all of the cases. And after a while, whatever agent is writing it will get responses from headquarters about, this matches this matches that, blah, blah, blah. Well, in my conversations with Mr. Martin, I said, okay, so yeah, the Key family saw this. And I said, wow, that's pretty impressive. He says, yeah. And he says, Dave, I know you also wrote about these other cases in the area. And he said, you specifically mentioned this FBI agent. I said, yeah. And he says, do you know that FBI agent committed suicide? I probably had a deer in the headlights looking at him. He said, no, that's true. And after we left, we did confirm that agent did commit suicide. And when a family is at its lowest possible point, and they look to law enforcement, and they look to the government for support, and they get lies and evasiveness, can you imagine what that would do to you as a person at that lowest point in your life? It's completely debilitating. I mean, I talked to Mr. Martin about it, and I don't know how he didn't go completely crazy on the Park Service for what they did to him. And he told me, he said, Dave, this is the reason why I don't trust the press and I don't trust the government. He said, they lied to me, they were evasive. He said, the only guy that was even was honest to me was Dwight McCarter. He said, he tried to help me understand, but even he couldn't understand why they didn't think at the beginning that this wasn't an abduction and handle it appropriately. So McCarter, I asked him about that, and he said, well, he goes, a few years before Dennis disappeared, this was a time when the rangers were not armed in national parks. And he said a ranger was working alone in a back area of Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and he was attacked by what McCarter described as a wild man, meaning a guy living off the grid like you and me, that lived off animals, that wore furs and didn't have any ethics. And he said that this wild person attacked the ranger and almost killed him. And he said, he goes, the only thing I could think of is that this family saw one of these wild men that lives in the parks, that the Park Service doesn't want to acknowledge lives there, and maybe took Dennis. But he says, it'd be conjecture at this point, but he goes, I don't know what else to think of it. Actually, it wasn't a remote viewer, it was a psychic. He had written in to the Park Service and supplied a report that was in this massive amount of documents. And this guy had some apparent notoriety for the time and said that his mind had a difficult time going to where it was going because it was such a dark place. And he thought there was a creek nearby, there possibly was a cave, but that what was happening to Dennis was beyond the realm of his comprehension. It was along those kind of lines. Very bad, very dark, kind of almost a horrific scenario. He didn't go into much more detail than that, and I think it's interesting because we have a couple of guys that live in that area that know that park like the back of their hand, and I can tell you that we have done extensive research, and we can't find an area where there's a cave access and a creek running through it because we've made some big efforts to find it. So I can only look at it from a common sense and a factual viewpoint, and that is that many of these have occurred pretty deep in the wilderness where there's not a lot going on, and the idea that there's a human abduction process taking place, I know a lot of friends that are backpackers that carry guns, and if somebody's going to try it, there's going to be some shooting going on, and you never hear about that. And what I've explained on other shows is whatever is happening here is 100% effective. If they weren't, we would hear about a mistake or we would hear about an attempt, and we don't hear about that. So Tristan, the family lived, I guess, on the outskirts of the community, kind of near a wild area, but Tristan's playing in the yard. And again, he's playing with the family's Jack Russell Terrier. His mom, Stacy Owens, goes in the house for just a couple of minutes, she says. She returns back to the yard, and Tristan and the dog are gone. Now, if you're gone for that period of time, your voice should be able to carry far enough to pick up a 2-year-old boy and his dog. And Tristan didn't respond, and the dog didn't respond. So she looks, and she gets some neighbors to help, and an hour later they call the police and the sheriff, and they respond out. And a big search, and the searchers, they're looking around till midnight. They're calling the boy's name. They're not getting anything. And that disturbed them a lot because they didn't think that Tristan could get that far, and they thought that the dog would respond to the mom's calls to come back, and neither did. So the fire department, the sheriff's office, everybody calls their people in, and 2 firefighters decide to stay in the woods, and they were going to stay out there and try to hear anything, smell anything, just try to be the eyes and ears out there as late as they could stay out. And as they're out there, they hear a scream in the woods, And then they think that they hear coyotes